Good day, Pierce College students. Welcome to week 5 macroeconomics. We're going to start off class tonight by looking at some current macroeconomic news in the Wall Street Journal. Then we're going to review some of the concepts we covered last week. And then we're going to get into fiscal policy. Let me share my screen with you peoples. All right, so students. The first piece of information tonight we're going to talk about from current macroeconomic news is the trade deficit. So I'm going to switch this page here. You can see this. All right, so in any given year, the United States exports goods and services to citizens in other countries, right? Those are called exports. So US companies produce goods and services and they're purchased by people and people's living in other nations. An example of this would be Ford Motor Company produces a Ford F-150 in Detroit, and then somebody in Scotland purchases it. So that's a US export. Service, good example of a service would be US company such as Goldman Sachs involved with financial services. Let's say they offer financial services to a German individual or a German company. That would be a US export of a service, right? Now, you're probably very familiar with US imports. We buy lots of textiles, clothing, and such, lots of products from China. A lot of what we buy is called made in China. Those are obviously called, there is US imports, right? We buy goods and services from countries all over, all other countries in the world. So if in 1 year, let's, for simplicity, let's say that the value of US imports exactly equaled the value of US exports. So let's say there was $1 trillion worth of exports and $1 trillion worth of imports. We would have a balance of trade. But that hasn't been the case in quite some time, right? It's very, almost a statistical impossibility to even out. Now, there could be a situation where exports are greater than imports. The last time that happened was 1975. We would have what's called a trade surplus when exports, the dollar value of exports, is greater than the dollar value of imports. So every year since 1985, we've had a trade deficit where imports, the dollar value of the goods and services we purchase from companies in other countries, is greater than the exports that we produce and sell to people in other nations. So last year, this was just reported 2 days ago, the US trade deficit hit a record high. So US trade deficit for 2022, 948, that's in billions, $948.1 billion. So we imported $941.8 billion more in goods and services than we exported. So our trade deficit is pushing $1 trillion, right? Now, is that good? Is it bad? Indifferent? That's a great normative debate. We do know one economic lesson from everything we've studied. There is always a cost. You can't have something for nothing. So in order for the United States to run a trade deficit, we have to finance the deficit. And we finance the deficit by either selling off real American assets or borrowing. The US is the world's largest debtor, DBTOR, debtor nation. So we can't have this trade deficit without financing it. And financing the trade deficit is one of those good economic debates. All right. The second thing I wanted to talk about as far as what's going on with current US economic information is what's going on with the unemployment rate. And I know my screen is taking its good old time here refreshing, but I'll start talking about it before I give you the title of the article. All right, so we know that roughly, in economic terms, 4% unemployment is considered what we call full employment, or the natural rate of unemployment. Last week, the United States posted extremely strong jobs numbers for January, much stronger than expected. So the United States posted extremely strong job numbers for January, and Now this poses a question. With the economy growing pretty quickly and the unemployment rate falling to a multi-year low. So US unemployment fell to 3.4%, its lowest rate since 1969, right? Jerome Powell and friends at the Federal Reserve are now worried that we might have a longer battle with inflation than previously expected. That our battle with inflation could go on a bit longer because low unemployment means more spending power for consumers. It also means upward pressure on prices or the price level. So this extremely excellent jobs report comes at a time when the Fed is already worried about inflation. So this fits in perfectly to what we're studying as far as our macroeconomic equilibrium with our tools, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So there's our current macroeconomic information. Right, we're going to go back to some other information in a few moments, but let's now get into the heart and soul of what we studied last week and what we need to tackle this week. So the focus of this week's class is what's called fiscal policy. And we'll define fiscal policy in more definite terms in a moment, but just think federal government involvement in the economy. That's what we mean by fiscal policy. All right, so we got the president, all right, the House, the Senate, all right, we got Congress and the executive branch and their involvement in the US economy. That's fiscal policy. We'll come back to this and define it more formally in a few moments. For now, let's review what we learned last week. So we talked about Keynesian economics, and we're going to review that idea of the multiplier soon. Right? And we talked about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model of the economy. So let's review this all-important aggregate demand, aggregate supply model of the economy. What's the purpose of this model? Now, this is going to sound all fancy and intelligent, but it's really not that complicated. Right? The model helps us make sense of what's called macroeconomic equilibrium. Now, if you said that, somebody goes, oh man, economics is so hard, it's confusing. Like, not necessarily, right? So what we have here is on the vertical axis, we're measuring the general price level in the economy. On the horizontal axis, we're measuring GDP and unemployment. So the purpose of this model is to find out in a current state of economic affairs and macroeconomics, how quickly or slowly is the economy growing, that's GDP, right? What's going on with the employment picture, right? What's the current unemployment rate? And what's inflation? So that's the purpose of the model, to determine current levels of our three macroeconomic variables of interest. Right, so aggregate demand is total spending in the economy, CIGX. Consumer spending, which is about 70% of total spending. Gross business investment, which is when companies purchase machines and equipment and refurbish factories and build plants and such. Right, all construction, that's 16% of the economy. Government spending, which is about 18% of the economy. And then exports. So all told, all spending by all buyers, so all buyers, CIG and X, right? How much do these buyers want to purchase at the given price level? The price level, remember, is measured on the vertical axis. Now, we're going to use the short run aggregate supply aggregate demand model because we want to know what's going on with the economy today and talk about adjustments if / when necessary. So this is the short run aggregate supply curve. And it demonstrates or shows us graphically the amount of real output or the amount of goods and services in total that all companies, all producers, all firms want to make available at the given price level. So when we bring these two together, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we have macroeconomic equilibrium. So as we move left to right on this horizontal axis, GDP output, right? Real GDP adjusted for inflation, that's increasing as we move in this direction. So as we produce more goods and services, as the economy strengthens, the unemployment rate falls. So we're simultaneously measuring two of our variables on this horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we're measuring the general price level. We usually report what's called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That's the most widely utilized measure of inflation. Now, the Fed has its own measure. They call it the PCE, or the Personal Consumption Expenditures. There's the producer price index. You get the idea. We're measuring the general price level, right, in the economy. How much inflation is there? As pictured on the board, we got everything's perfect. Right? GDP is growing at about 2%, sorry, 2.7%, 2.75%. Unemployment is about 4%, and the price level is about 2%. Everything is perfect. This is called the Goldilocks scenario. So we would never have to worry about fiscal policy if the economy resembled this macroeconomic equilibrium all the time. But we know about this thing called the business cycle. What when there's a huge decrease in spending? So everything was perfect, and then look what happened to aggregate demand. All right, let's say consumer spending fell off a cliff, gross business investment got weaker, right? So the stock market declined, the home prices went down, business confidence and potential profits for the next 6 to 12, 18 months is declining. So C&I, the private sector, consumer spending and investment spending is declining, and it's declining by a multiple amount. Remember the multiplier from gains. So at our new macroeconomic equilibrium, what's happened? Well, GDP has faltered, right? It's moved this way. So declining real output. GDP is, we're in a recession. It's because we're in a recession, that means unemployment has gone up. So it was 4% here. Now we're at, I don't know, say 9, 10% unemployment. So because private sector spending, consumer spending, and business spending on machines, equipment, and tools and factories and plants is weak, there's no upward pressure on prices. Inflation's only 1%. Right? Now we could have a different issue, and this is what's going on today. Right? Now we look and say, geez, look how far right aggregate demand has shifted. Everything was perfect. Aggregate demand shifts way right. Right? What we have is what's called an excess of spending. This is demand pull inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. Right? Spending is exceeding the economy's ability to keep up with production. So what's going on with those three variables at this macroeconomic equilibrium? GDP is not the problem, right? We were here, GDP is growing, but it's growing almost too fast. Right? Unemployment's not the problem. It's like today. But look what's happened. Price level is going up. We have this inflation, right? Too much spending relative to the economy's ability to keep up with production. So we use the tools of aggregate demand to make sense of the economy. Now we're going to be talking again in detail about fiscal policy in a moment, but we have to introduce 3 ideas: federal budget, deficits, surpluses, and balanced budget, right? And then we have to talk about how a deficit is funded. And then we got to talk about the long-term idea called the national debt. So let's do that. The federal government obviously collects taxes. They collect lots of taxes. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but they are necessary to provide things like military spending and Medicare and Medicaid and education and federal spending on highways and such. Right, so we need those tax revenues to make all of these infrastructure and human services that we need, right? That it wouldn't be possible without taxes. So in one given year, the federal government collects a lot in taxes. Obviously, the federal government spends on those items I just mentioned. If federal government tax revenues were $4 trillion and federal government expenditures were $4 trillion, the United States would have a balanced budget, the federal budget, right? Now don't mix this up with the trade budget, trade deficit. Right? So federal government, right? How much money are we spending in Washington, D.C.? If tax revenues and expenditures are equal, we have a balanced budget. But we know what's been happening for quite some time, really ever since the 90s, is that expenditures, federal government expenditures, exceed tax revenues. Federal government expenditures are greater than tax revenues. So when tax revenues fall short of expenditures, or expenditures exceed tax revenues, the government incurs what's called a federal budget deficit. That's a federal budget deficit. Now, in one year, if tax revenues were greater than expenditures, we'd have a federal budget surplus. That hasn't happened since the 90s. So how do we finance a deficit? This is important. Remember, nothing is free. So in the years where expenditures exceed revenues, what happens is that the government needs to borrow, and they borrow by issuing debt We call these government bonds. So we got the 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 7 year, 10 year, and 30-year bonds. So literally, individuals, institutions, other countries, they buy government bonds. They say, okay, we'll buy government debt. And the government is issuing debt. Now, the government has to pay interest on that debt, right? And there's a cost to that because they say, oh, geez, it's not available for other expenditures. Now, believe it or not, federal government debt or government bonds are considered the safest financial instrument on earth. There's a 99.9998% chance you're going to get paid back. So if we compare all the years that we had deficits relative to the few years we have surpluses, we call that difference the national debt. In other words, how much debt have we piled up over time? So think of yourself. I borrowed $2,000 on a credit card 5 years ago. I borrowed $3,000 the next year. I borrowed $7,000 the next year. Right now, you paid a little bit of it off, right? But you still have this huge balance. That's what we mean by the national debt. So be prepared to be overwhelmed by these next statistics. When we look at what's going on in the real world with the national debt, we have this thing called the national debt clock, and I'm apologizing for my computer running so slowly. It just has a mind of its own today, right? But we need to talk about, geez, what is the actual national debt of the United States? Come on, computer. Give it a moment. There we go. So the U.S. debt clock, and there's a lot of numbers here. This is a bit overwhelming. The United States now has a national debt of 31. See up top on the left here? And that is $1 trillion. What? Yes, $1 trillion. We've accumulated $31 trillion worth of debt. That's the national debt, U.S. national debt right here. So this shows you for this year, here are our tax revenues, 4.6 trillion. Here are our expenditures, 6 trillion. So 6 minus 4, right? Well, 4.6, right? 6 minus 4 would be 2, but 6 minus 4.6 is 1.4. We're going to have a federal budget deficit. See here, it says it's $1.4 trillion for the year. Right? Now, this is an excellent website. Gives you all kinds of information. You should spend some time looking at this. If you want to know where to find it, here's there's the web address right there on the PowerPoint slides. All right, let's talk about fiscal policy. So, what is fiscal policy? After the Great Depression, the United States realized we can't let an economic catastrophe of this magnitude ever happen again. So in 1946, we passed what's called the Employment Act. And we instituted the Council of Economic Advisors and the Joint Economic Committee to oversee the macroeconomic picture for the United States. So here's what happened. We said, all right, the government has to get involved with the economy. Can't let another Great Depression happen. So fiscal policy is active changes in government spending or taxes with the goal of affecting aggregate demand, right? Everybody says shifting aggregate demand, same idea, right? So start off with an important idea. Number one, there's always going to be a level of government taxation and a level of government spending, right? That's always going to be the case. There will always be government spending and there will always be taxes. Fiscal policy means that Congress, the House and the Senate, get together. They propose a bill and the president signs it into law, and the law changes the current level of government spending or government taxes, federal government taxes. That's what we mean by fiscal policy. Now, a key word here is discretionary fiscal policy. So for our class, we're talking about what's called discretionary fiscal policy, because there will be automatic changes to spending and taxes just because of the business cycle, things like unemployment benefits going up and down, depending on how many people have jobs and don't have jobs. or government expenditures and government revenues based on how much economic activity is taking place. So discretionary fiscal policy is what we're studying and how it affects the US economy. So we're going to concentrate on how discretionary fiscal policy affects aggregate demand and how it works into the model we just explained here, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So let's assume for a moment that the US economy has fallen into recession. Now I like this picture because it shows you graphically, like in detail, what's going on. So the US economy is in a recession. Look how far left aggregate demand has shifted. So consumer spending is weak, investment spending has faltered. GDP is well below its potential. So we have a recession. GDP is negative relative to last year and the year before. All right. Real GDP is weak. Therefore, unemployment's high. It's pictured here. This is 11% unemployment. There's not much upward pressure on prices. So the question is, what can the government do to kickstart economic activity, to get the economy back on track? How can the government use discretionary fiscal policy to affect aggregate demand? Well, first, if the economy is in a recession, the proper fiscal policy is called or referred to as expansionary fiscal policy. The federal government wants to expand economic activity. So what are their choices? Well, the federal government has three choices. The federal government can increase government spending. The federal government can decrease taxes, or the government can use some combination of the both. So again, real quick, the economy has fallen into recession, private sector spending is weak. Consumer spending bad, investment spending bad, real GDP is falling, unemployment's high, no upward pressure on prices. The government knows it's mandated to do what they can to try to get the economy back on track. They're going to institute expansionary fiscal policy, sometimes called fiscal stimulus, stimulating the economy. So they can cut taxes, they can lower tax, they can increase government spending, or they can use some combination of the both. So in this graph, they show you, okay, what if the government spends $5 billion, let's say on roads, on road improvement to try and kickstart the economy. And in the textbook, they say, well, assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. And so you say 1 over 1 minus 0.75 is 1 over 0.25. That means the multiplier is 4. So remember the Keynesian idea that the initial change in government spending is only part of the story. When we take into consideration the multiplier, GDP will actually increase not just by the initial 5 billion, but by 20 billion. And you see what's happened. Government spending has influenced aggregate demand. The government spent on road improvements. All those contracts meant economic activity that didn't exist in the economy now increases spending. So the $5 billion of government spending, after you consider the multiplier, right, the initial change in spending times the multiplier, $20 billion increase in total GDP. If that's successful, right, obviously GDP has increased from where we were to where we are, which means unemployment will actually start to fall. And eventually we're going to have some healthy upward pressure on prices. Right? A little bit of inflation is actually a good sign for the economy. Now, the government can also cut taxes. But here's a really important idea. If the government cuts taxes by $5 billion, right, all hardworking Americans get a tax cut, they're going to get a rebate, or their tax is going to be lowered in their check. Not all of it will be spent because some people will save some of the tax cuts. So when we cut taxes by $5 billion, our initial increase in spending is not $5 billion, it's only 75% of $5 billion. So any tax cut would have to be greater than $5 billion to get the same ultimate increase in GDP. Now, most likely the government will use the last approach here. So when the economy is in a recession and GDP is weak, unemployment's high, and fiscal stimulus is in order to affect aggregate demand, the government will cut taxes and the government will increase government spending. So they use a combination of both approaches. So what happens if a recession is not the problem? Well, if a recession is not the problem, we might be experiencing what's called demand pull inflation. So let's look at that scenario. Again, I like these exaggerated graphs because they really show you what's going on with GDP, unemployment, and inflation. So if this is the current state of macroeconomic equilibrium, right, then GDP is not the problem. Right about here would be a nice sweet spot. Spending is getting too strong. Right, we have demand pull inflation, which is to say the total amount of spending by consumers, businesses, right, it's exceeding the economy's ability to produce. And we really see this with this third segment of the aggregate supply curve area, this vertical range, right? We can't produce beyond a certain point because we have limited resources and fixed technology. So the government looks and says, okay, GDP is not the problem. Economic output is strong. Economic output is strong, that means unemployment is not the problem, right? We just read an article from the Wall Street Journal that says, man, 3.4%, lowest unemployment rate since 1969. Like the Beatles had played their last show on a rooftop in London. Neil Armstrong was walking on the moon. Right, Paris Peace Accords about the Vietnam War. It's a long time ago. How do we get this price level down? Right, it said in the article, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell is worried about inflation. Right? So what can the federal government do? What can the president and the House and the Senate, Congress, what can they do to, right, same tools, opposite direction. The government can cut spending by $5 billion. And the multiplied effect would be totally 20 billion, assuming that the marginal propensity consumer is 0.75 and the multiplier is 4. Again, I'm just using these numbers because they're the ones in the textbook, right? So the government can cut spending. The government could also use the tax level, increase taxes, take money out of people's paychecks. Right? Less money available means a decrease in aggregate demand. Right? And then a total decrease in aggregate demand after the multiplier effect. Now remember, any tax cut would have to be greater than spending because, right, people save some of it and they spend some of it. Now, most likely the government would use some of both, increase taxes and cut spending. But here's the thing. These are not politically popular tools for Washington. When demand pull inflation is the issue, cutting government programs, like cutting government spending, is not a popular option for politicians. Raising taxes. When was the last time you heard a politician say, we're going to raise your taxes? I remember when Ross Perot ran for government and he's like, we're going to raise the gasoline tax. We're going to try and pay down this national debt. And he's the only one who had the honesty to say what he was going to do. But raising taxes is not politically popular. So, yes, increasing taxes, cutting government spending would ultimately bring down aggregate demand, which would bring down inflation. Probably not as likely. Plus, we're going to study monetary policy and how our nation's central bank could address these issues. Now, there is a degree of what's called automatic stabilizers. So we just talked about discretionary fiscal policy. Like discretionary fiscal policy. Why is this not so pretty? I said thing there, it's so annoying. Sorry. So automatic stabilizers. Right, here's the idea. Perhaps the government doesn't need to pass a new bill and have it signed into law by the president. When the economy is in a recession, unemployment benefits increase. That's an increase in government spending, just what we wanted. And at the same time, we want a decrease in taxes. Well, if the economy is in a recession, there's far fewer economic activities taking place, which means sales tax, like corporate taxes on revenue, all that's going to fall. Now, what about when the economy is super strong like it may be today, where inflation is the problem? Well, inflation is the problem. We want less government spending. Well, when inflation's a problem, unemployment rate's really low, so that type of government spending is withdrawn from the economy. And we want an increase in taxes. Well, with super strong economic activity, sales tax increase. Like people paying into the Social Security system, more people working, more people paying taxes. Right? So we call this idea of what we call built-in stabilizers. Without having the government to pass a bill and sign into law by the president, we have these automatic adjustments in spending and taxation based on the business cycle. We know that if you have a more progressive tax system, these built-in stabilizers will be stronger. So two ideas. Number one, if built-in stabilizers automatically adjust taxes and spending based on the business cycle, why would we ever need fiscal policy, discretionary fiscal policy? First reason, and only reason, primary reason. When you build a dam, it's designed to hold back a certain amount of water, right? But sometimes a storm that you don't expect overwhelms the levee. So think of fiscal policy as things are more serious than just the built-in stabilizers. All right, now, one more idea about built-in stabilizers. If we were to change the tax system, that is to say, increase tax rates, yes, like I said, we'd have a more of a built-in stabilizer, but the economy would grow slower. So if you look at the 20 years prior to the financial crisis of 2007, Europe had much higher tax rates. European economic growth rates were about half that of the United States. So again, you can't have something for nothing. All right, now, fiscal policy sounds great, but it's not without its worries. So what are the criticisms of fiscal policy? The first criticism is called the problem of timing. So the economy has fallen into recession. So let's look at that real quick, right? Let's assume that the economy has fallen into a recession, right? So when the economy is in a recession, what's going on? Decrease in aggregate demand, right? GDP has fallen, so GDP is negative from its previous high. Unemployment is rising, no upward pressure on prices. And that's the issue with the economy at the moment. The timing problem says first, we don't notice that the economy is in a recession immediately. So we call that the recognition lag. The first part of the timing criticism is what's called the recognition lag. Now, in 2007, it was obvious we were heading into the economic abyss. 2020, the economy, we voluntarily shut down. So this doesn't always apply. But the next one does apply. Democrats want one thing, Republicans want something else. Democrats are usually proponents of more government spending, and Republicans are bigger on cutting taxes. I'm not getting political, I'm trying to make observations. So a conservative politician would be an advocate of cutting taxes during a recession, whereas a more left-leaning liberal economist would be a proponent of increasing government spending. So here's the idea. It's going to take a while to come to some decision based on the politics of Washington. We call that the administrative lag. So we take the first two, the time it takes to realize we're in a recession, and then the time for the House and the Senate to come to agreement on what bill to pass, right? We also have what's called the operational lag, which is to say, all right, we've decided that XYZ program will be instituted and it's going to increase spending. All right, so let's stick with the idea of highway spending. Well, if the bill is passed on February 1st, on February 2nd, there's no increase in spending. On March 2nd, there may be no increase in spending. On April 2nd, you might have to do things like environmental studies and you're going to have to hire the companies. We call that the operational lag. It's the difference between the time of when the monies were approved for spending and when the buck actually hits the road, so to speak, right? When do dollars become donuts? So that might take a while, right? So that's the timeline. Now there's the political business cycle. All right. Federal government has the luxury of running a deficit. Now I say luxury, they should try not to do it, but been doing it for so long. The federal government can have a situation where expenditures exceed revenues. Federal government expenditures are greater than tax receipts or revenues for the year. Federal government borrows money to finance that federal budget deficits. State governments don't have that luxury. So at a time when the economy is in a recession and the federal government is cutting taxes and increasing government spending to address the recession, state governments are doing the opposite because they're mandated by their charters to have a balanced budget. So state governments are looking for ways to cut spending and ways to raise taxes. And you're like, well, why would they raise taxes during a recession? Well, there might be ways to do it without really saying you're doing it, like writing more speeding tickets, right? So think of this as the yin and the yang, the pull and the push. At the federal level, cutting taxes, increasing spending. At the state level, increasing taxes, cutting spending. Right, federal government, cut taxes, increase spending. State and local governments, increase taxes, cut spending. So some of the fiscal stimulus, some of the expansionary fiscal policy instituted by the federal government is going to be offset by the state activities. All right, that's what we mean by offsetting state and local finance. All right, the crowding out effect is an interesting one. All right, I'm going to come up here to a slide. As you think about that, write it down, crowding out effect. All right. So we're going to look at this slide real quick. This is a picture of the domestic money market. Oh, sorry. It's not in this set of slides. It's all right. We don't need it per se. All right. I'll go through it. I could take me 5 seconds to bring this up here. All right, let me just bring this up for us. Okay, look, the money market. So I'm going to start talking about what happens. This way we'll save time. So the economy is in a recession. And GDP is faltered. Unemployment's high. And there's no upward pressure on prices. So that's the current economic situation. We looked at this a few times already on this video. Aggregate demand has shifted left. GDP is faltered. GDP is weak, negative. Unemployment is rising up to 10%. No upward pressure on prices. We have 1% inflation. The federal government decides they're going to institute what's called discretionary fiscal policy. They're going to cut taxes and increase government spending. A little combination of both approaches. So remember that idea of the deficit. If we had a balanced budget, there's going to be a deficit. And if we already had a deficit, there's going to be a greater deficit. Very important point here. In order for the federal government to finance discretionary fiscal policy, the size of the deficit has to increase. Remember, you can't have something for nothing. So here's what's called the domestic money market. This is the quantity of money, demand and supply. This is the price of money, but we don't call it the price of money, we call it the interest rate. So before we had, this one's backwards, that's right. We had this demand for money here and this supply of money. Now we're gonna get into this next week, actually, the money market. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply. So at some point in time, it's fixed, that's why it's vertical. So stay with me here. Here's our current demand for money. Here's our supply of money. Let's assume that R2 is 4%. But then the government cuts taxes and increases government spending. Both of these will increase the size of the deficit. In order to finance the deficit, the federal government has to go into the money market. They're going to increase the demand for money. They're going to push up interest rates, right? So when we talk about the crowding out effect, Like this idea here, the crowding out effect, it's a pretty straightforward idea. The federal government institutes discretionary fiscal policy to address a recession, faltering GDP, high unemployment. At the moment, inflation's not the worry. The federal government cuts taxes and increases government spending, some of both. Both of these expansionary fiscal policy measures will increase the size of the deficit. To finance the deficit, the government increases demand for money. Increased demand for money pushes up interest rates. We already know that interest rates affect spending, buying of homes, buying of cars. When companies look and say, oh, I got to borrow money to make this new project work. I got to borrow money to build that new factory. Higher interest rates slow economic activity. The cost of borrowing has increased. So what we mean here is by crowding out is that federal government actions, aka expansionary fiscal policy, aimed at expanding at stimulus, at increasing aggregate demand will work, but some of that will be offset, will be crowded out by higher interest rates, right? That's what we mean by the crowding out effect. Now, the textbook goes into, how about in the long run, the long term? What about when the federal government continues to use discretionary fiscal stimulus or expansionary fiscal policy, and we continue to increase the size of that $31 trillion national debt? Geez, that could end up having a long-term effect on interest rates and a long-term idea of crowding out private sector spending. All right, my friends, that wraps it up for this week. Remember, Connect assignments, discussion board, and quiz. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need assistance with anything related to our class. Have a great week.